Pick that up, sweetheart." That was how Dr. Sterling spoke to the nurses at Oak Creek Memorial, not to Margaret Walsh specifically, but to all of them, as if their names had been replaced by diminutives that fit inside his mouth like dental floss. He was the kind of man whose power was so thoroughly woven into the hospital's infrastructure that nobody bothered measuring it anymore. His uncle's name was carved into marble on the West Wing. 3 board members took his calls at dinner. His family had endowed the cardiac wing in 1987, and every year the foundation sent flowers to his office on the anniversary. Margaret had worked at Oak Creek for 3 years without speaking more than necessary in a staff meeting. She arrived 40 minutes before her shift, left 40 minutes after, and kept her hands busy with 4 lines and patient charts and the small mechanical tasks that made her invisible in rooms full of louder people. The ICU nurses respected her. She knew how to calm a thrashing patient without raising her voice, knew how to catch a doctor's mistake before it became a problem, knew how to work a code like she'd been born knowing it. But respect wasn't the same as recognition. Recognition required people to look up. The morning of September 17th had been ordinary. Cool. The antiseptic smell of the ICU cutting through the humidity that Savannah hadn't released since July. Margaret stood at the supply cart in the hallway, her sleeves rolled to the elbows as she counted syringes, when she felt the vibration in her bones before she heard anything. Helicopter rotors. Close. Getting closer. She didn't look up. She knew the sound. Had heard it 10,000 times from inside a Humvee, from inside a landing zone, from inside a place she no longer allowed her mind to visit. The rotors changed pitch. Landing sequence. Trauma incoming. The intercom crackled, incoming helicopter from Fort Stewart. ETA for minutes. Trauma code, MVA with ejection, male patient, approximately 32 years old, GCS of 7, unresponsive. Margaret's hands didn't pause. Syringe. Count. Syringe. Count. The ticking of the clock in her chest that had never quite stopped since Marjah didn't accelerate. She breathed the way she'd been taught to breathe, in for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. Muscle memory. The kind that didn't ask permission. The ICU erupted into that controlled chaos that happens when everyone knows exactly what they're doing. Beds were cleared. The trauma team assembled. Dr. Sterling emerged from his office in the East Corridor, his white coat unbuttoned, his posture announcing arrival the way other men announced rank. He moved through the ICU like a man accustomed to space reshaping itself around him. Margaret finished counting and shelved the syringes. She was already in her scrubs, already washed to the elbows. There was nothing left to do except wait. She positioned herself at the ICU entrance, out of the traffic pattern but close enough to move if she was needed. The helicopter touched down on the roof at 08 for 7 hours. She didn't check the clock. She didn't need to. Her internal chronometer had been calibrated to military time for so long that civilian clocks felt like an approximation. They brought him down on a stretcher, and Margaret saw the trauma before she saw the patient. Clothing shredded. One arm stabilized with a vacuum splint. Head swollen. The kind of swelling that told a story about what the brain had been doing inside the skull. The paramedics called out vitals as they moved, blood pressure 60/40 and holding barely, heart rate 128, respirations 24, GCS of 6, unresponsive to pain. The trauma team peeled away to surgery. Margaret was turning back to the supply station when she saw Dr. Sterling watching the patient move past him. Not with the focus of a surgeon mentally running through procedures. With something else. The kind of glance that measured power dynamics. The kind of look a man gave when he was calculating how much space a person occupied and whether he needed that space for himself. The patient was Sergeant Kyle Morrison, according to the paperwork that arrived 30 minutes later. Special Forces. Fort Stewart. Single vehicle accident, high speed, driver ejected 47 feet from the vehicle. What happened after was the standard choreography of intensive care, imaging, lab draws, ventilator management, the slow work of keeping a broken body from shutting down while the neurosurgeons waited to see if the swelling would kill him or if he might live with the kind of damage that made living into a complicated question. Margaret was assigned to his care. She didn't volunteer. She was simply the nurse with the open bed and the reputation for knowing how to handle patients whose minds were no longer occupying their bodies. She settled into the rhythm of his unconsciousness, checking pupils every hour, adjusting the ventilator settings, monitoring the intracranial pressure sensor, watching for the cascade of complications that followed trauma like a shadow that gets longer as the sun gets lower. By noon, she'd learned the shape of his hands. Long-fingered. Scarred across the knuckles. She'd learned the sound his chest made when the ventilator pushed air into him, a wet sound, like water in a basement, which meant his lungs were starting to fill. She'd learned the tattoo on his forearm, still visible despite the swelling, a name. Walsh. Just one word. Black ink. Military tattoo station work, not professional. She'd learned his name and his injury and his unit designation, and she'd learned all of it while keeping her own name folded somewhere deep, pressed against her ribs, unspoken. The chaplain who had been her husband used to say that grief was just love with nowhere to go. She thought now that maybe the inverse was true too, maybe hidden history was just identity with no place safe to land. Her jacket hung in her locker in the employee break room, the one she'd worn for the last 3 years only to her car, never inside the hospital, never anywhere she might be asked about the patches sewn into the lining. The faded unit patch. The one that told a story about a woman who had led combat medics through Helmand Province, who had carried wounded soldiers for miles through terrain that bled the color out of everything, who had been called Valkyrie by men who were no longer alive to call her anything. She'd learned to be quiet. Quiet moved through hospitals without creating disturbance. Quiet was a form of invisibility, and invisibility was the only way to survive a second life you hadn't chosen but had accepted anyway. It was 2:34 p.m. when Dr. Sterling made his first appearance in Sergeant Morrison's room. Not for rounds, formal rounds weren't until 5 o'clock. This was something else. This was the kind of appearance a man makes when he's heard something about a person and wants to verify it. Sterling stood at the foot of the bed, hands in his coat pockets, watching the ventilator expand and collapse the patient's chest. Margaret was checking the drip rate on the dopamine infusion, her back to the doctor, her movements precise and economical. She could feel his attention the way a deer feels a predator's gaze across open ground. "This one's from Fort Stewart," Sterling said. "Not a question." "Yes, doctor," Margaret said. She didn't turn around. She adjusted the 4-line with a small twist of her wrist, checking the patency of the port. Motor vehicle accident. High-speed impact. Special forces. That's what the admission papers say. Sterling stepped closer to the bed. He reached out and pulled the bandage away from Morrison's arm, the one with the tattoo. The vinyl peeled back with a sound like someone ripping paper. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she kept her hands on the equipment. "Walsh," Sterling said, reading the name on the forearm. Somebody loved him. Or somebody he loved. Margaret said nothing. She secured the 4-line and turned to the monitor, where the heart rate jumped from a baseline of 94 to 102. The patient's eyes didn't open, but something in his unconscious mind had registered the disturbance. "Leave him," Margaret said. Her voice was flat. Professional. The kind of voice that could ask for a bedpan and make it sound like a request that had no alternative. Sterling replaced the bandage, but he took his time with it, pressing the adhesive down slowly, deliberately. When he finished, he turned to Margaret with the kind of smile that men wore when they decided they enjoyed their own company most of all. "You're protective of him," Sterling said. "I'm protective of all my patients. Protective of the soldiers, I mean." Margaret looked at Sterling directly for the first time. His eyes were the color of a winter sky after all the warmth had been extracted from the season. She counted the heartbeats in the monitor behind her, 98, 99, 100, while she decided what her face should do. "Every patient deserves the best care," she said. Sterling nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. He walked to the bedside, and he moved the way men move when they're accustomed to being admired, his shoulders back, his chin level, the kind of confident posture that comes from never having been told no in his own life. He was 44 years old. He'd never been ejected from a vehicle. He'd never felt his own blood running backward into his lungs. He'd never stood in a sandstorm trying to keep someone alive while his hand shook. When he wakes up, Sterling said, he'll want to know about his injuries. The neurological damage is significant. The orthopedic fractures will require surgical intervention. I want to be very clear with him about the limitations he'll be facing. When he wakes up, Margaret said, he'll be confused and probably terrified. He'll need reassurance first. Medical detail second. The room went silent. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The cardiac monitor beeped its steady pulse. Sterling's expression didn't change, but the quality of his attention shifted. She felt it the way you feel a temperature drop. She'd just contradicted him. She'd just spoken as if her opinion mattered. She'd just made a very small mistake. I'll be the one to determine what he needs, Sterling said. His voice was pleasant. That was the worst part. The complete absence of anger made it feel like a statement of fact, like pointing out that water was wet or that gravity pulled things down. Of course, Doctor, Margaret said. Sterling left the room, and Margaret stood alone with the unconscious soldier and the sound of his mechanical breathing, and she felt the weight of her own history pressing against her sternum like something trying to push its way out of her chest. She reached up and touched the collar of her scrubs, feeling for the point where her pulse moved against her neck. Still there. Still moving. Still keeping rhythm with the ventilator and the monitor and the clock that had never quite stopped ticking since Marjah. She didn't know that Sterling was the kind of man who kept score. She didn't know that she'd just begun a game she didn't remember agreeing to play. All she knew was that Sergeant Kyle Morrison lay in a hospital bed with her name tattooed on his arm, and he didn't remember her at all. The moment Dr. Sterling entered Morrison's room that Friday morning, Margaret knew what was coming. His eyes moved over the Special Forces soldier with the kind of dismissive contempt he reserved for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves, the one society had already written off as problems rather than people. Morrison lay semi-conscious, post-op sedation still clouding his awareness, his breathing shallow and even, vital signs stable enough on paper. Sterling pulled a chair close to the bedside and snapped his fingers twice in front of Morrison's face, sharp sounds like a gunshot in the quiet ICU. "Settle down, soldier boy," Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're not in the sandbox anymore. You're in a real hospital with real doctors." Morrison's eyes fluttered, confusion crossing his features. His hand jerked reflexively, muscle memory firing from some combat dream, and Sterling grabbed his shoulder, not checking it, not steadying him, but gripping him hard enough that Margaret heard the fabric of the hospital gown tear slightly. She was 3 feet away, charting vitals at the computer, but she felt the moment like a seismic shift. Sterling's fingers dug in. "Easy, easy," he was saying, but his tone had the edge of someone enjoying the power. The heart monitor's rhythm changed. 65 beats. 70. 82. Morrison's eyes went wide with terror, his breathing quickening, pupils dilating as some part of his traumatized brain recognized threat even if his conscious mind couldn't place it. Margaret moved before she thought. Not fast, controlled, purposeful, her body angling between Sterling and the bed with a kind of precise geometry that left no room for interpretation. When she spoke, her voice came out level and steel calm, each word a separate sentence. "Touch him like that again. Pause. And I'll file a report." The words hung in the recycled air. Sterling's hand froze on Morrison's shoulder. His face went very still, the way a predator's face goes still when it realizes something else in the room might actually have teeth. He stared at her for 3 long seconds, Margaret meeting his gaze without blinking, without flinching, her body positioned between her patient and his hands like a wall. Sterling smiled then, but it was the smile of someone who'd just upgraded a minor annoyance to a personal problem. "Noted, Nurse Walsh," he said, and removed his hand from Morrison's shoulder with deliberate slowness. He stood, buttoned his white coat, and walked out without another word. Behind him, the room exhaled. Margaret turned back to Morrison, checking his shoulder for bruising. There would be none that showed, nothing that would matter on any official record, and adjusted his pain medication by 2 milligrams. Her hands were steady. That was the worst part. Her hands didn't shake. Morrison's eyes found hers as she worked. "Did you?" he started, confusion clouding his words. "Shush," Margaret said, and he settled, because her voice was the kind that made people obey even when they didn't know why. The next morning during rounds, the entire ICU staff assembled in the corridor outside the patient rooms. Residents, nurses, respiratory therapists, the unit clerk, 12 people waiting for Sterling to conduct his performance. This was the show he put on, the assertion of dominance dressed up as medical education. He moved from room to room with a chart in his hands, and when he reached the spot where Margaret stood near the medication dispensary, he didn't slow down. He just let the chart fall. It dropped from his fingers to the tile floor with a soft paper scatter sound, pages spreading like a broken bird, and Sterling crossed his arms and looked at Margaret with amusement etched into every line of his face. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice pitched loud enough for the entire unit to hear. "Unless you're too busy playing hero." The silence was immediate and complete. A respiratory therapist's pen froze mid-note. One of the residents looked at his shoes. No one moved. Margaret took one measured breath. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, the weight of their attention like pressure in her chest, and then she knelt. The tile was cold through the fabric of her scrubs. She gathered the papers with deliberate care, stacking them in the correct order, her movements precise and unhurried. A single tear escaped down her cheek, but she didn't break eye contact with Sterling, not once. She rose and handed him the chart. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, Doctor," she said quietly, and something in her voice, something that didn't match the meekness of the action, made 2 residents suddenly find reasons to be elsewhere. Sterling's smile tightened. He'd expected tears or anger or some kind of breakdown. He'd expected to win. Instead, he was left holding a chart from a woman whose eyes had just gone distant and old in a way that made his skin prickle. By Wednesday, the betting pool had started. Sterling held court in the cafeteria during lunch, surrounded by a cluster of hospital administrators and 2 board members who'd come in for a quarterly meeting. His voice was loud enough to carry across the lunch line. 7 days, he was saying, smirking at the faces around him. "I give her exactly 7 days before she walks. Anybody want to take that action?" He laughed, a sound like broken glass on linoleum, and someone from administration chuckled along with him, the sound of complicity that always made the powerful feel safer in their cruelty. Margaret stood in line holding a tray, waiting to pay for a turkey sandwich and a cup of soup. She could feel Sterling watching her. Could feel the moment he spotted her and made the decision about what came next. He stood, excused himself from his conversation, and walked directly into her path. The collision was casual, designed to look accidental, his elbow coming up to nudge her tray as he passed, a simple movement that sent the entire plate scattering. Soup. Silverware. The sandwich sliding across the tile floor. The sound was small and terrible. The cafeteria went silent. 30 staff members watched. Sterling didn't pause. He just kept walking, and the message was impossible to miss: even your lunch isn't safe here. Margaret stood frozen for 3 heartbeats, staring at the scattered mess. Her jaw clenched so hard she thought her teeth might crack. The trembling that started in her hands wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 18 years of combat discipline holding back something primal and furious and absolutely lethal. She took a single breath, long, measured, clinical, and then she knelt in the spilled soup. The liquid was warm and salty against her knees. She gathered the silverware piece by piece, the fork, the spoon, the knife, each one wet and cold between her fingers. She wiped one tear with the back of her hand, not submission, she would never submit, but the release of pressure before it became something that would end careers. She stood, met Sterling's eyes across the cafeteria with a look that could have burned through steel, and said, "I'm still here, Doctor." Her voice was quiet enough that only the people closest to her heard it, but it landed like a promise. She walked out without looking back, without rushing, without giving him the satisfaction of her fear. Behind her, the cafeteria resumed eating, but no one was tasting their food anymore. That evening, Margaret drove home through rain that hammered the windshield like applause. She showered, changed, waited until the evening shift was fully settled, and then she drove back to Oak Creek Memorial at 8:36 p.m. The ICU was quieter at night. Dimmer. Morrison's room was dark except for the glow of the monitors, the ventilator's steady whoosh the only sound beneath the beeping of the heart rate. She didn't turn on the main lights. She used the pen light from her pocket, the edges of the beam catching Morrison's face in profile as she checked his adjusted his fluids, verified his medication doses. His eyes opened slightly. Confusion clouded them at first, then something else, a moment of clarity that didn't quite hold, like a light flickering before the power failed again. He stared at her face for a long moment, then his eyes moved down to his own forearm, to the tattoo that read Walsh in block military letters, scarred and faded from whatever trauma had put it there. "Do I know you?" he whispered, and Margaret felt something break open in her chest. She froze. For 3 seconds, 4, 5, too long. She had her hand on his bag and she couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but exist in the space between who she used to be and who she was pretending to be. "No," she said finally, and her voice sounded like a stranger's. "Get some rest." She finished her checks, left his room, and didn't look back. Behind her, Morrison kept staring at the tattoo, confused, as the medication pulled him back under. Friday afternoon, Morrison's monitor alarm screamed like something dying. A high-pitched wail that cut through the ICU and sent 3 nurses running. Margaret reached his bedside first. His oxygen saturation was plummeting, 98 to 92 to 87 in less than a minute, and his respirations had gone shallow and rapid, his body working hard but his lungs not cooperating. His trachea was deviated. His jugular veins were distended. The classic triad of tension pneumothorax, the kind of catastrophic lung collapse that killed soldiers in the field in Marjah when they didn't have someone who knew what to do. Dr. Sterling entered the room, already irritated at being pulled from a consult, already wearing the expression of someone about to waste time on something that could have been handled by lesser staff. "What are we looking at?" he demanded. Margaret didn't look away from Morrison's face. "Tension pneumothorax. He needs needle decompression. Now." Sterling's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask for your diagnosis, nurse. Get me a chest X-ray." The monitor alarm continued its screaming. 84%. 79. Morrison's lips were turning blue, a shade of oxygen deprivation that meant there were minutes left, not hours. Margaret's eyes met Sterling's. "No time," she said flatly. "He needs decompression now." Sterling hesitated for a second that felt like an eternity, then pulled his stethoscope and fumbled with it, checking Morrison's breathing sounds with the methodical confusion of someone who didn't really know what to listen for anymore. His face showed it, the uncertainty flickering there like a broken light bulb. The code team was 3 minutes out and Morrison's blood pressure was dropping, his body shutting down, and Dr. Sterling was standing in front of a monitor he didn't know how to read. He froze. Margaret didn't ask permission. She moved like muscle memory had a voice, her hands already on a large bore needle from the crash cart, 14 gauge, the kind that could stop death if you knew where to put it. She palpated Morrison's second intercostal space with hands that remembered exactly what that cartilage felt like, exactly where the right angle was. Her training was older than her civilian identity by a decade and a half. She inserted the needle with absolute precision, pushing through skin and fascia and pleura in one smooth motion. The hiss of escaping air filled the room, the sound of a lung re-inflating, of death being held at arm's length for one more day. Morrison's oxygen saturation climbed. 92. 97. 100. Color returned to his face like someone had turned a switch. Sterling's fear dissolved into something much more dangerous, rage. "You just performed an unauthorized procedure," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "That's my license on the line because you decided to play doctor." Margaret lowered the needle, her composure absolute, her voice steady in a way that made Sterling's hands curl into fists. "He'd be dead if I waited," she said. Sterling pointed to the door. "Get out of my ICU." Margaret walked out past the stunned nurses, past the code team arriving in the hallway, past everything, and she didn't look back. She walked to the parking lot and sat in her car with the rain hammering the windshield and her hands finally shaking on the steering wheel. In his office, Dr. Sterling made the first call before Margaret had even reached the exit. "We have a liability issue," he said to the board member on the other end of the line, his voice steady now, calculated, dangerous. "Nurse Walsh just performed a surgical procedure without authorization. Needle decompression. She's going to kill somebody, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it was her." The monitor screamed. Friday afternoon. 2:13 p.m. The alarm cut through Oak Creek Memorial's ICU like a blade, and every head turned toward room for 12. Sergeant Kyle Morrison's oxygen saturation had plummeted from 96% to 78 in 45 seconds. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but the numbers kept falling. 74, 69, 65. Margaret was at the charting station, 3 rooms down. She didn't need to look up to know which patient had coded. The quality of the alarm, the pitch, the cadence, told her everything. Tension. Not hypoxia. Not sepsis. Tension. The kind that kills in minutes. She moved toward the room without running. Running panics people. Running makes families scream. Her boots were silent on the tile floor as she covered the distance in 8 seconds, muscle memory from a field hospital in Helm and Province guiding her footsteps like a map burned into her spine. Dr. Sterling was already there, standing in the doorway with his hand on the frame. His face had gone the color of old hospital walls. The bedside nurse, Rodriguez, competent but junior, was bagging Morrison manually, her rhythm steady but her eyes darting toward Sterling like she was waiting for orders that weren't coming. The respiratory therapist had paused mid-adjustment, one hand frozen on the ventilator dials. "What's his pressure?" Margaret's voice was level. Conversational. 89 systolic and dropping, Rodriguez answered, relief flooding her face at the presence of someone who sounded certain. Breath sounds absent on the left since the alarm started. "I tried to tell." Sterling still hadn't moved. His jaw was clenched so tight Margaret could see the muscles working beneath his skin. She'd seen that look before, in junior officers during their first incoming fire, in surgeons during their first hemorrhage they couldn't stop with pressure alone. Fear. Pure, crystalline fear. The kind that paralyzes you when you realize the situation is clinical, not social. When credentials stop mattering and competence becomes the only currency that holds. Margaret stepped to the bedside. 89 systolic. Falling. She didn't need a stethoscope to confirm, the asymmetry in Morrison's chest wall was visible from 3 feet away. Left side wasn't moving. The skin had that stretched, waxy look that came with pressure building inside, nothing to escape. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung compressing the right side of his heart. In approximately 4 minutes, his blood pressure would bottom out. In approximately 5, his heart would stop. Needle. She reached out, and Rodriguez placed it in her palm before Margaret had finished the word. A 14-gauge angiocath needle, the kind designed for emergency decompression. Margaret had used them before. Not in an ICU. In a field tent that smelled like copper and diesel and sand that never quite left your lungs. In situations where you didn't have time to wait for a chest tube, didn't have surgical teams standing by. Just hands and needle and the knowledge that if you got this wrong, the patient was dead anyway, so there was no failing that mattered more than speed. She found the landmark without hesitation. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Left side. Her left hand steadied Morrison's chest, ribs beneath her palm like something caged, and her right hand moved with the terrifying fluid precision of muscles that had done this under mortar fire and helicopter rotors and when the world was ending. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle, angled downward over the rib, and the moment the needle hit the pleural space, the sound came. The hiss. The beautiful, terrible hiss of air escaping. Months of training, years of instinct, all of it confirming in a single sound that she'd placed it right. Morrison's chest deflated like the universe was taking a breath. The ventilator's rhythm changed immediately, less resistance, more air moving, and Rodriguez's hand moved to the monitor without being asked. O2 sat climbing. 82. 88. 92. Blood pressure 94 and stabilizing, the respiratory therapist called, her voice tight with adrenaline. Margaret removed the needle, left the catheter in place, and stepped back. Her heart rate hadn't increased. Her hands weren't shaking. The muscle memory had taken over completely, the part of her that had seen too much to be frightened by what she could actually control. Sterling had not moved. He was still in the doorway, his face a portrait of something past fear, something that looked like watching your authority dissolve in real time. A moment ago, he'd been the most important person in this room. A moment ago, he'd been the one everyone looked to. Now he was just a man who had frozen while a bedside nurse saved a patient's life, and everyone knew it. Rodriguez knew it. The respiratory therapist knew it. The two residents peeking in from the hallway knew it. And Sterling knew that they all knew. Margaret was adjusting Morrison's oxygen settings when Sterling's breath came back. That was a direct violation of protocol. His voice was different now, higher, tighter, like someone working hard to make noise mean something. You performed a procedure without physician authorization. I was assessing the situation. Margaret didn't turn around. She didn't look at him. She marked Morrison's vitals on the chart with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times and would do it 1,000 more. 96%. Climbing. Stable. The kind of stable that meant Morrison would live to see Saturday. The patient coded, Margaret said quietly. I treated him. I was the physician in charge. You were paralyzed. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Rodriguez's hand froze over the medication dispenser. The respiratory therapist suddenly became very interested in the ventilator dials. Sterling's face went from pale to something darker, something with color underneath it now, something that had shifted from fear into something else. Something that burned. He left the room without another word. His footsteps didn't echo down the hallway. He was quiet. He was controlled. But Margaret had learned long ago to read the kind of anger that moves like predators, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that plans. She checked Morrison's pressure one more time. 98 systolic. Perfect. The sergeant was sleeping now, his body finally receiving enough oxygen to stop screaming. His left arm lay across the blanket, and the tattoo was visible in the afternoon light streaming through the window. Walsh. Her name. Permanent. A mystery to him, probably. A memory he couldn't access because the shrapnel had taken it, the faces, the names, the woman who had dragged him through 3 miles of enemy fire while his blood soaked into her uniform and her lungs burned with dust. Rodriguez touched her shoulder. Thank you, she whispered. I didn't know what to do. Margaret nodded once. She didn't tell Rodriguez that she was a good nurse, that she'd handled the situation correctly, that Rodriguez had nothing to apologize for. Sometimes acknowledgement was enough. Sometimes words were just a way to make silence feel less heavy. What she didn't know was that Sterling had made 3 phone calls while standing in the hallway. One to Gerald Hutchins, the board member whose daughter Sterling had saved during a charity gala 3 years ago, a debt Sterling was now calling in. One to Chief of Staff Dr. Barbara Chen, requesting an urgent meeting about a pattern of dangerous unauthorized procedures. And one to his cousin Patricia Morrison, who owed Sterling money and now owed him a phone call to HR describing her concerns about her brother's treatment. The wheels had been set in motion 3 hours ago. But this moment in Morrison's room had accelerated everything. What Margaret didn't understand yet was that Sterling had just shifted from calculated sabotage into pure survival mode. She had shown him up. She had made him look incompetent in front of his staff. She had saved a patient while he stood frozen. He wasn't going to let that stand. Margaret finished her charting and clocked out at 6:15 p.m. The sunset over Savannah was the color of burnt copper, and the parking lot smelled like hot asphalt and the first hints of rain coming in from the coast. She loaded her car with the same movement she'd used 1,000 times before, muscle memory that didn't require thought, that didn't require deciding whether you were a nurse or a soldier or just a woman trying to exist in a world that would never quite understand what she'd been or what she'd cost. She didn't know that by Monday morning, her career at Oak Creek Memorial would be strategically, systematically, and completely dismantled. Sterling's office overlooked the parking lot, and from his desk he watched the ICU team disperse into the afternoon, their shoulders still carrying the weight of what had happened in Morrison's room. 42 minutes. That's how long it had taken Margaret Walsh to do what he couldn't do, to move with the kind of precision that belongs in trauma bays and forward operating bases, not in a civilian hospital where hierarchy meant something, where credentials mattered more than muscle memory, where a surgical director wasn't supposed to freeze when a patient's lung collapsed. He didn't freeze often. He didn't freeze at all, actually, until the moment when he saw her hands move. By 1400 hours, his phone was already in his hand. Gerald Hutchins answered on the first ring, board member, cardiologist, the kind of colleague who understood that institutional power was built on networks, not competence. Gerald, we have a serious situation in the ICU. Margaret Walsh, the civilian RN, just performed an unauthorized needle decompression without physician authorization. Direct protocol violation. Could have killed the patient if she'd miscalculated. He let the lie sit for a moment, let the concern register. I need this documented. We can't have nurses playing surgeon in our facility. The second call went to Dr. Patricia Chen, Chief of Staff. This one required a different angle, concern wrapped in professionalism, like antiseptic on a wound. Patricia, I wanted to flag something that happened during rounds today. One of our nurses took it upon herself to perform an advanced procedure. I'm sure she meant well, but we have protocols for a reason. I've already prepared documentation for HR. Thought you should be aware before this becomes a larger problem. The third call was to Margaret's direct supervisor, and Sterling's voice took on the tone of a mentor. I'm concerned about Margaret's judgment lately. Excellent bedside manner, but I'm seeing some boundary issues. She's overstepping her scope of practice. I think we need to build a file, just in case. By 1600 hours, Sterling had his folder assembled, 12 pages of invented policy violations, each one carefully worded to sound plausible to administrators who spent more time in meetings than on patient floors. Unauthorized medication administration. Operating equipment without proper training documentation. Failure to follow chain of command. He'd learned long ago that specificity was the currency of credibility. Numbers made lies sound like facts. Dates made fabrications feel like history. The meeting with Patricia Chen happened in her office at 1700 hours, late enough that the halls were quieting down, the fluorescent lights buzzing their evening frequency. Sterling arrived with the folder in one hand and his concern in the other, arranged like a man protecting the institution he loved. Patricia, I hate bringing this to you. Margaret's a good person. But we have liability issues. This folder documents a pattern. I've already spoken with Gerald and 2 other board members. They're concerned too. Patricia opened the folder with the careful hesitation of someone about to find something she didn't want to find. Sterling watched her face as she read, the slight frown, the pause at the invented details, the reflexive reach for her reading glasses to examine signatures he'd carefully forged from Margaret's employment file. He'd done this before. Not often, because he was usually too valuable to most institutions to need such crude tactics. But Cedar Creek Hospital in Tampa, before he'd moved to Savannah, had taught him that sometimes removing obstacles required paperwork instead of brilliance. This is serious, Patricia said quietly, setting the folder on her desk like it might detonate. I know. And I didn't want to bring it up, but you know my family's history with this hospital. My uncle wouldn't want to see our standards compromised. Sterling let that statement breathe for a moment. The cardiac wing's name, Sterling Cardiovascular Center. The endowment that had funded it. The quiet understanding that some donations came with expectations attached. I think we need to put her on administrative leave while HR investigates. Protect the institution. Patricia's hesitation lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then she nodded. I'll call HR now. The email to Human Resources went out at 1745 hours, composed by Sterling himself from his hospital account, purporting to be from a patient family member he'd personally coached during visiting hours. Dear HR, it read, I feel unsafe with this nurse's care practices. I witnessed her performing procedures without proper authorization. My family has decided to transfer to another facility. We reserve the right to pursue legal action. The email included Margaret's full name, her unit number, and her shift schedule. Sterling even added a personal touch, a fake family name and room number that wouldn't exist in the system, details vague enough that they couldn't be immediately disproven but specific enough to sound credible. By 1830 hours, Margaret's badge access was disabled. By 1900 hours, she was meeting with Patricia Chen and a human resources representative in a small conference room with no windows, the kind of space designed for difficult conversations. Sterling waited in the hallway and watched through the small window in the door as Patricia explained the administrative leave, as Margaret's face remained perfectly still, as the HR representative slid a cardboard box across the table. Margaret's locker was emptied by 1945 hours. Sterling caught a glimpse of her from 3 corridors away as she carried the box toward the parking lot, shoulders level, movements efficient, not the shape of a person collapsing under pressure but the posture of someone who'd carried heavier things. The box was standard cardboard, institutional beige, the kind used for evidence and terminations. Everything she'd kept in her locker, scrubs, a stethoscope, a framed photo of a man in Navy chaplain's dress whites, all of it reduced to the contents of a box that weighed less than her shift had weighed just hours before. Rain started falling as Margaret drove out of the parking lot, and Sterling watched from the administrative windows as her car turned south toward the old part of the city. He didn't know where she was going. He didn't need to. By Monday morning, the investigation would be officially closed, her resignation would be processed, and someone more compliant would be hired to fill her position. Margaret Walsh would become the kind of small failure that hospitals accumulated, a personnel matter, a note in a file, a cautionary tale about knowing your place. He was wrong about the rain. Margaret drove through sheets of it, the kind of downpour that makes the world outside the windshield abstract and unreal. She drove south, past the hospital, past the strip malls and chain restaurants, past the modern sprawl of Savannah that looked like every other American city. She kept driving until the city gave way to something older, moss hanging from live oaks like the trees were weeping, narrow roads that curved through centuries-old burial grounds, the kind of place where the past was still present tense. Bonaventure Cemetery appeared through the rain like a memory. Margaret pulled through the gate slowly, let the car idle while she oriented herself by instinct, the way soldiers navigate in darkness. Third row. Left fork. Near the water oak with the iron bench beneath it. The headstone read, Samuel H. Walsh, Chaplain, United States Navy, 1978 to 2018. A simple stone. White marble. His rank, his service branch, the engraved cross that meant he'd spent his career with people in crisis, listening to confessions and fears that no one else got to hear. Margaret stood in front of it for a long time without speaking, rain soaking through her jacket, running down the stone in rivulets that made the inscription blur and clear, blur and clear. I tried to start over, Sam, she said finally, her voice barely audible beneath the sound of rain hammering the graveyard. I tried to be normal. Just a nurse in a quiet hospital. Nobody special. Nobody dangerous. She pressed her palm flat against the marble, the stone cold enough that it felt like touching something essential, something that couldn't lie. I thought if I could help people without anyone knowing what I was, what I've done, what it cost, I thought maybe I could live with it. Maybe I could exist without destroying everything I touched. A gust of wind moved the branches overhead, sending a cascade of water down across her shoulders. Margaret didn't move. But it's still there, Sam. It's always there. Every time someone needs help, every time I see someone in pain, the soldier comes back. The medic who knows exactly what to do. The one who doesn't ask permission, who doesn't follow protocols, who just acts because people die when you hesitate. Her breath shook slightly. I saved him. I saved that veteran twice. And now I'm on leave for it. And I can't even explain why without explaining everything, who I was, what I did, who I still am underneath the scrubs. She slid down to sit in the mud beside the headstone, arms wrapped around her knees, and stayed there while the rain continued and the day moved toward evening. The groundskeeper eventually found her as dusk settled over the cemetery, moved her gently to the gate, told her they were closing. Margaret nodded and drove home without speaking. Her kitchen table was where she spread out the contents of the cardboard box that night. The scrubs, the stethoscope, the photo of Sam in his dress whites. And beneath the folded jacket at the bottom, the thing she'd hidden for 3 years, the faded unit patch, 75th Ranger Regiment's distinctive emblem, sewn into the jacket's inside lining with meticulous hand stitches that had taken her 42 nights to complete. The only proof she'd ever been Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. The only evidence that Valkyrie had ever existed outside of classified files and redacted reports and the memories of men who'd learned to survive because of her. She traced the stitching with one finger, the way a person might trace a scar, learning its topology by touch. Her phone rang at 2,147 hours. Blocked number. She let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately. Then a third time. On the fourth call, she answered. Is this Margaret Walsh? A young woman's voice, steady but careful, like someone reading prepared remarks into a phone. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. Who is this? My name is Rachel Morrison. My father is Sergeant Kyle Morrison. He's a patient at Oak Creek Memorial, the one you just saved. Pause. He woke up about an hour ago, and he remembered something. He remembered your name. He remembered Marjah. He remembered you carrying him 3 miles under fire after an IED took out our convoy. Margaret's breath stopped. She didn't speak. He's been trying to figure out how to thank you for 7 years, Rachel continued. He got your name tattooed on his arm the day after you saved him. He never understood why, not after his brain injury took everything else. But tonight he understood. And he asked me to find you. Rachel's voice steadied. Ms. Walsh, I'm calling the hospital board tomorrow. They need to know who you are. They need to know what they just did. Margaret whispered, please don't. I have to, Rachel said. And the line went dead. Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock, the fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn above the ICU as Kyle Morrison's eyes opened fully for the first time since the helicopter brought him in. His vision cleared slowly, like fog lifting off Chesapeake Bay, and in that clarity he found Margaret standing beside his bed during her unauthorized visit, the one the hospital didn't officially know about. She was checking his monitors, her movements economical, her hands steady as surgical lasers as she adjusted the fall line. Morrison's mouth opened. One word came out, rough from the breathing tube but unmistakable, Valkyrie. The monitors seemed to hold their breath with him. That single word, a call sign she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 13 years, stopped her hand mid-gesture. She didn't flinch. Didn't turn away. Just held his eyes for 3 seconds, then nodded once, and his attending nurse, Dr. Rachel Chen, watched the entire exchange from the doorway with her pen frozen mid-note. Within an hour, Rachel's hands were trembling as she dialed Morrison's grown daughter. Her voice shook as she said the word she'd rehearsed 3 times first, you put Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh on administrative leave. The woman who saved your father in Marjah. Silence on the other end. Then, what are you talking about? And Rachel, gripping the phone so hard her knuckles went white, explained everything, the medical emergency, the needle decompression, Margaret's 13-year-old tattoo on Kyle's forearm, the hospital's investigation into whether saving his life constituted a policy violation. The daughter's voice came back different, sharp as a blade, someone's calling the Navy. The next morning, a man in Navy service dress blues walked through Oak Creek Memorial's front entrance. His bearing was the kind that made the hospital's power structure shuffle instinctively sideways. Lieutenant Commander James Garrett, SEAL liaison to the medical board, carrying Margaret's complete service file in a manila folder that felt heavier than its weight suggested. The boardroom fell silent when he entered. Dr. Sterling sat in the back row, still wearing his smirk-like armor. The hospital administrator, a trembling man named Webb who'd spent the last 6 days convinced this was a routine meeting, sat at the table's head. Garrett didn't sit. He opened the folder and read aloud in a voice that sounded like a tank idling in a garage, 3 Purple Hearts. Chen paused. The room went dead silent. 2 bronze stars. Pause. The air pressure in the room seemed to change. Silver star for Valor under enemy fire. Webb's face had gone the color of old parchment. And Garrett continued, his eyes moving to Sterling's for just a moment. Classified decorations for operations she still cannot discuss. That phrase, still cannot discuss, hung in the air like smoke. It meant she was operating under security protocols that exceeded everyone in this room's clearance level. Sterling tried to interrupt twice, something about hospital policy and unauthorized procedures, but the hospital's attorney, a woman named Webb's superior whom nobody had told would be present, simply stood up, walked to Sterling's chair, and turned him around without speaking. Escorted him out. Silence filled the space where he'd been, the kind of silence you could operate in. The defibrillator on the wall seemed to hum louder. Nobody moved. Morrison's daughter arrived that afternoon with a file of her own, medical records from 2010, correspondence with Kandahar Regional Medical Center, a letter from a chaplain describing a dust-covered medic carrying a wounded soldier 3 miles through hostile territory. She placed a framed photograph on the boardroom table, taken in a field hospital in Marjah, a woman with desert in her eyes and blood on her uniform, holding a barely conscious soldier upright. Everyone in the room recognized Margaret now, even if they'd never seen her like this, armed with history instead of a stethoscope. The investigation accelerated after that. IT Director Marcus Reyes, a Marine who'd served 2 tours with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, had been quietly waiting for someone to ask what he already knew. When the hospital attorney requested cafeteria security footage from the day of the lunch tray incident, Reyes delivered it immediately, not because Sterling had requested it, but because Sterling had specifically requested its permanent deletion 3 days earlier. Deletion, Reyes explained to the board, that he'd explicitly refused. But he preserved everything anyway. Automatic backup systems, he said flatly, run 24 hours a day. The footage showed Sterling deliberately angling his shoulder toward Margaret's tray as she walked past. The contact was deliberate, casual as a predator testing the fence. He watched it fall. Laughed with 2 residents as she knelt to gather the silverware. Then, later that same day in a parking lot, Sterling coached a woman, his cousin Patricia, the record showed, through the exact complaint she'd filed with HR. Here's what you'll say. Here's the time frame. Make sure you mention how unprofessional she was about it. The boardroom was silent as that footage played. Then silence again as Webb pulled Sterling's personnel file. 14 complaints from nurses over the past 2 years. 5 of those complaints had been dismissed or buried by Sterling himself, who had influence with the previous HR director. 5 peer reviews he'd filed against nurses who'd questioned his judgment on treatment protocols. 2 malpractice near misses, both times blamed on nursing errors, now requiring re-investigation now that someone was actually looking at them. His uncle's name on the hospital wing suddenly looked less like an accomplishment and more like a liability. The Medical Board of Georgia received a formal complaint 2 weeks later. Sterling's hospital privileges were suspended pending external review. His practice, built entirely on Oak Creek Memorial referrals and his uncle's reputation as a philanthropist, collapsed like a house built on sand. Partners distanced themselves. Insurance companies flagged his file. Patients called to cancel appointments. By month's end, he was facing board certification review for the falsified complaints. The humiliation of it wasn't spectacular. It wasn't public. It was simply the systematic dismantling of everything he'd built by people who finally cared enough to look. Margaret, fully reinstated with a formal written apology signed by the hospital CEO, returned to find her locker decorated with handwritten thank you notes from 23 staff members. Most were unsigned. She didn't display them. Just slipped them into her pocket and returned to work like she'd never left. Morrison, recovered enough now to speak with clarity, asked to see her that evening. He was sitting up in his hospital bed when she entered, stronger, clearer, more present than he'd been in 2 weeks. He reached for his forearm, where the tattoo had lived unmarked and mysterious for 13 years. "Rachel told me everything," he said. "I don't remember Marjah. Don't remember you carrying me through the desert. But I remember this." He tapped the word inked across his skin, Walsh. "And I remember waking up every day wondering who you were." Margaret sat beside his bed, the machines around them beeping their steady rhythm, and Morrison reached for her hand. "You taught me what duty looks like," he said. "Thank you for saving me twice." Margaret's composure held, it always held, but something shifted in her breathing. Just one long exhale, the kind that releases years of weight. "You're welcome, Sergeant." She squeezed his hand once, then released it. 6 months passed in the kind of montage that real life rarely allows, Margaret training new hires in emergency procedures with a precision that made them understand this wasn't about protocols, it was about never forgetting why the protocols existed. Morrison in physical therapy, his strength returning, his memory still fractured but his gratitude intact. Rachel visiting weekly, building something that looked like family from the wreckage of crisis. The hospital implementing new whistleblower protections, a policy named for the incident but never explicitly named, because the people who mattered understood what it meant. Then the envelope arrived on Margaret's kitchen table on a Thursday morning. White House stationery. Official seal. Her hands didn't shake as she opened it, they never shook anymore, but something in her chest did. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, the letter began, "You are invited to the White House to receive the Chief Petty Officer of the Year Award." A nomination, the letter explained, that had been submitted before her retirement 13 years ago and lost in bureaucratic shuffling until someone finally decided to look for it. The ceremony would be in 3 weeks. Margaret held the letter without reaction, but that night she sat at her kitchen table until 2 in the morning, the faded unit patch sewn inside her old jacket lining on the table beside her. She didn't cry. Didn't allow herself to. Just sat with the weight of recognition that had come too late and at the price it always cost. The drive to Washington took 2 days. Margaret took the scenic route, driving through Virginia with the windows down, past farmland and pine forests, past lives that looked simple from the highway. She passed through a strip mall outside Quantico on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of place where small failures come to rest. At a folding table beneath a sagging banner reading Sterling Insurance, We Care, a man in an undersized blazer sat surrounded by brochure stacks and a clipboard with almost no signatures on it. Dr. Sterling. His face was carefully blank as Margaret's car slowed, carefully neutral as he pretended not to recognize her through the windshield, pretended this folding table and these blank pages were not the consequence of 2 years of cruelty finally catching up to him. She didn't stop. Didn't wave. Just watched him for 3 seconds, then drove on toward the city. That moment, the one where he disappeared into her rearview mirror without ever lifting his eyes, was worth more than any apology he could have offered. The White House ceremony came and went in the way important moments do, swiftly, surrounded by cameras, official and clean. Margaret stood in navy dress uniform, ribbons arranged in order of precedence, silver anchors gleaming under the lights. Kyle Morrison beside her in his wheelchair, strong enough now to sit unassisted, his daughter Rachel standing behind them, both holding that framed photograph from Marjah, the one showing a dust-covered medic carrying a wounded soldier through the desert. The president shook Margaret's hand, said something gracious that the cameras caught but nobody remembered, and pinned the medal to her uniform. But the photograph that ran in every military publication the next day wasn't from that moment. It was the one taken afterward, when Margaret and Kyle were alone for just a second, when his hand had found her arm and their eyes had met over the photograph his daughter held. The caption read, Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh receives the Chief Petty Officer of the Year Award alongside Sergeant Kyle Morrison, whom she saved in Marjah in 2010. Morrison, who lost his memory of the deployment due to traumatic brain injury, recognized Walsh 13 years later when she saved his life a second time at Oak Creek Memorial Hospital in Savannah. The image of his hand on her arm. The image of her eyes, quiet, present, unbroken. That photograph went viral in military communities, shared by veterans who understood that true heroism lived in moments the world doesn't see. Margaret returned to Oak Creek Memorial 3 days later. Scrubs. Stethoscope. The same quiet competence that had hidden everything for 13 years. A new resident approached her nervously, a young woman who'd clearly been told the story but was meeting the legend for the first time in person. "Chief Walsh," she asked hesitantly, "could I get your opinion on this ECG?" Margaret accepted the chart without ceremony, studied the rhythm, made her notes, and handed it back with a squeeze to the resident's shoulder. "That's good work," she said simply. "Keep that instinct." The resident stared at her like she'd just received a blessing from a saint. Margaret was already moving on to the next patient, the most decorated combat medic in recent Navy history, back to being invisible again, exactly how she wanted it. Because true class, as someone once told her, is what you do when the lights go out, when nobody's watching, when there's no medal waiting. She'd forgotten that for a while. A man in a cafeteria, with a lunch tray and a smirk, had reminded her why she should never have. If this story speaks to you, if you've ever been underestimated, ever stood quiet while the world judged you wrong, please subscribe. Hit that like button. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever seen someone hide the best part of themselves just to survive? What would you do if the truth finally came out?